Hello and welcome to the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michaela, and today I have the pleasure to talk to Daniel Vassallo, a former Amazon engineer and now an entrepreneur in free spirit. Daniel got internet famous by sharing that he left his cushy job at Amazon, which paid $500,000 per year, can you imagine? And his main motivation for leaving was that he wanted to be more independent, but also challenged again. After that, he shared his attempt to build a successful business on Twitter, and since then he managed to get a really large Twitter following. And even though his first SaaS business did not work out as planned, he averages around $23,000 in profit each month. Yeah, but without further ado, let's dig into Daniel's interesting success story. Daniel, I'm really thrilled that you're on the show. Thank you for being here.
Of course. Thank you, Michaela. Nice to meet you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited. So when I go to your website, I have a list of products that are linked there, right? And they're very diverse, which, is super exciting for me. I'm just, two of them I already mentioned, right? Which was a video course on how to build a Twitter audience. Then you have the good parts of AWS, which is a book. Then you have cutting boards there. Like wood cutting boards. I was like, wow, how does that fit into that? Then you have like profit and loss, which is some status updates on your business finances. And then finally, you have this SaaS business user base, which I'm also super interested in. How does that come about, right? That you have like a cutting board in between all of those a little bit more technical parts or products that you have.
Yeah. So I think I started this journey, I think in a traditional way, like many other software engineers. I thought I was going to be doing the bootstrap thing. I was going to sort of focus on one idea and build it and try to make it successful at all costs, putting all my effort into it. And I think what happened, that's what I started with. That's what user base was, right? When I started. A few months in, I started to have a little bit of, I would probably call it like a small crisis of anxiety. I was getting very sort of uncomfortable by the uncertainty that I was imagining in front of me. When will I know if this will succeed? What if it won't succeed? Like, what signals should I be watching for? What if it succeeds, but slowly? Like, should I be shifting attention to other things? And sort of, I had all these questions that I didn't really have an answer for. And I was noticing that I probably was underestimating how much uncertainty there is in doing something like this. That it's very hard to know. And this was a bit more confounding because actually I was getting very strong signals about user base back then, very strong. I dislike the term validation because I think sort of it implies something that it isn't there, but the typical signs that people look for validation, right? I was sort of had a mailing list of about 4,000 people waiting for the launch. I had endorsements by highly influential people, sort of the CEOs of like Netlify and Versal publicly endorsed the product, right? Sort of, and were very welcoming and sort of wanted to collaborate with their teams. Sort of many other things, even on launch day. I sort of, it was front page on Hacker News, product number one on Product Hunt. Even the initial day revenue were strong, like for about 40 customers, about $1,500 in sales. But yet, I was still noticing that, that it was uncertain, right? And in fact, that's what happened. It was much harder to keep the momentum of all the signals that happened. So, sort of that crisis a little bit opened my eyes, and I started thinking, if I want to make this arrangement, the self-employment arrangement, successful, probably I need a different strategy. I can't just be going all in into one thing, because I was worried that I was just going to run out of time, savings, and I have to go back to full-time employment, which isn't the end of the world. Like, it's not like it would be the end of the world, but I was enjoying being self-employed. I enjoyed the flexibility, the sort of freedom, the ability to work on what I wanted, and all those good things. So I don't really know what had happened, right? But sort of I had a small epiphany, and I wondered, what if instead of having plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D about, if this fails, I go to the next thing, and so on and so forth. What if I try to do a bunch of things at the same time? Small things, of course. I was realistic. I couldn't, I had limited, finite time like everyone. And that sort of changed my attitude to things. Instead of sort of focusing on one thing, I started looking around me, and I started asking myself, what can I do? Low-hanging fruit. That's what can I do that is a small thing, doesn't necessarily need to have large upsides, recurring revenue, or necessarily be sustainable for a long time. I was mostly looking at small wins. Right? What can I do? Something that can make me some money in 3 months' time with reasonably high odds. It's still
Hmm.
unpredictable. You never really know whether something is going to work or not. Even today, right, when I launch new things, I have no clue sometimes whether things are going to work or not. But it changed my perspective because before I was looking at things, does this have upside? Is this going to scale? Is this sustainable? And I think the trade-off that comes with that, those things that do have those properties tend to have low odds of succeeding. Right? They just to be hard, unpredictable, sort of affected by random things, good timing, and other things that are very opaque. And this had worked out really well for me. So now, to get back to your question, sort of the reason why now it looks like I have a very diverse portfolio of products is because I've been, the products are a manifestation of inspiration that I had over the last 2.5 years or so. And I ask myself, is this something that can be a small bet? Is this something that I can give it a shot? And maybe if it works, I keep it. If it doesn't, or if it becomes, too hard to do, or something that I'm disliking, I can just drop it. So it's been sort of a stream of experiments. Some things work, some things worked more than others, some things beyond my expectations, some things worked a little bit, but didn't meet my expectations. So as you can imagine, in a portfolio, it's like investments. I don't think the idea is that radical. We tend to do the same thing with how we invest our money. For example, that we almost consider it foolish to deploy all your life savings like in a single stock or a single asset. Right? We tend to want to diversify to tame uncertainty.
Hmm.
And I think more or less it's the same approach to my own ideas and my own small ventures, essentially.
Yeah.
So I know it's a general answer. Happy to dive or deeper into all the individual things, but sort of that's the general idea that I think
Yeah, I think
evolved over
that
time.
I think when I look at your projects and your products, I think what's also distinctive here is that they have a start and an end. So a lot of people
Mm.
have a lot of ideas, but they are continuous, right? So I'm starting with it and I can actually not stop them, but it's more something that I'm doing and I keep on getting busier and busier because I'm adding things to my portfolio, right? Let's say a SaaS
Mhm.
business user base is probably the exception here, right? It's not something that you start and then it already
Mhm.
ended. It has some maintenance cycle, as we all know with software, right?
Yeah.
And if it gets more successful, you will have to be more involved. But like a cutting board has a start and the end, right? You have the idea, you design it, and then it's
Mhm.
finished. And then maybe you have to sell it. Yeah, okay, but there's not really a lot of involvement in it. The same for the video course. You recorded
Mhm.
it and now you're selling it. The same for the book, right? You start it, you finish it. So do you
Mhm.
think that do you deliberately think about that when you're looking at your small bets? I
Mhm.
mean, there's like as we have finitive time, we probably have infinitive ideas on
Mhm.
what we can do. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. I'm struggling
Yeah.
with that. What should we take on? And there's always a pros and cons list, or however people make the judgment. Is this a finitive thing of I'm starting this and in 3 weeks or in 3 months I have it finished and then I'm done with it and so on? Is that something that crosses your mind, that you're thinking about it explicitly?
Yeah, definitely. It's sort of. I think I've developed a selection criteria. I like to call it. So it's sort of. It's. I think back when I started, I almost fell into the trap of running into the first opportunity that I felt that I could do, and I would just jump into it. So I think because it seems like okay, I can do it. Let's do it. Nowadays, I've become much more rigorous. I would say that with my selection criteria, and I'm feeling completely okay at peace, ignoring things that I feel like I can do. I can give a shot, but if they don't satisfy my strict selection criteria, I just leave them, for someone else or whatever.
Hmm.
Like they're just not mine. And what you mentioned is an important part of it. That is like I ask myself, is this something that I like to call it? Is this something where time is going to be my friend, not my enemy? I think what you're doing is you need to have the payoff happen before a certain period of time. Otherwise, you're going to run out of money or out of time or out of frustration or get demotivated. And I dislike that situation. I dislike that property. Right? So I try to avoid those as much as possible. I think with user base, I also made the mistake of what the kind of SaaS was. It's the kind of SaaS that requires unfortunately, 24/7 support. I have a PagerDuty app, right? Sort of sometimes I get paged in the 2 a.m. in the morning. Like nowadays, I would almost certainly avoid something like that, right? I would go for something simpler, almost certainly. Other parts of my selection criteria are also, is this something that I can build and bring to market by myself? Not because I think I know everything or I can do everything, but I think it's a good test to keep things simple, right? It's sort of a proxy for, is this simple enough that I can bring it to market by myself? Like if I change my mind or I decide it's not worth pursuing anymore, I don't have to make sure that everyone is on board, or I'm not sort of hurting anyone else. Concerns go away if I keep things simple that I can sort of do on my own. I did with user base, right? I've invested so much that then I started falling into the trap of sunk costs. Now I should invest even more. And I ended up spending, a ton of time, money, and more than what my risk appetite really was, right? So definitely a lesson learned. And what you mentioned, right? I really liked projects and ideas that sort of ideally have a start and an end, where time is my friend.
So what are some of the products that you started, or the ideas that you started that haven't
Yes.
succeeded yet, or maybe that you haven't even shared with the, are there some that you haven't shared even with with the people in the public? And
Absolutely. So there's the various difference of failure, degrees of failures as well. Certainly, I think worth mentioning user base is probably the biggest failure that I had. And this one, I did it before I was thinking about sort of the strategy, right? So I think it's a failure that led me to see things differently. But I almost feel embarrassed to say this, but I've spent almost $150,000 of my own savings building user base. It's crazy talking about it. And this is only making about $5,000 in annual revenue, not monthly, right? So almost certainly I will never recoup my money. Maybe I might try sell it in the future, but even there, I'm not expecting sort of large amounts. And I don't know if even that is an option. But as I mentioned before, I think my mistake was in the beginning underestimating uncertainty. I invested too much. I went all in. The more I went all in, the more I felt like I need to invest. And this was sort of this cycle of bad decisions. Putting that aside, however, there were a few other small things that I would not necessarily, they weren't big failures, but there were things that didn't really work as I expected. In fact, the very first digital product that I tried, not many people know about it, was I tried to sell a spreadsheet. This is a bit of a technical project. I started to sell a spreadsheet about benchmarking different EC2 servers, their network speeds. So back then, back in 2019, AWS didn't really advertise accurately what network speed you were getting and what network bandwidth you were getting when you were buying or using a particular instance type. I thought I'm going to run a benchmark test and measure exactly what type of performance you're going to get. I was building in public and talking about it. People were interested. And basically, long story short, I spent a week, wrote the tool, open sourced the tool, benchmarked everything, spent about $500. I did prepare a very sophisticated spreadsheet with pivot tables, very fancy spreadsheet. I was sort of very proud of it. I posted it on Twitter, posted it on Hacker News, Reddit, and a few other places. There was lots of interest and attention. It actually surprised me. I think the sort of landing page got about 30,000 views, which was even nowadays, that compared to my other products, it was a lot. But this sold nothing, right? I mean, nobody paid, and I was charging $10, like not like a crazy amount of money. Nobody bought it, right? And in fact, a few days later, I released it for free. And I think a lesson that I learned is back then, I remember thinking, wait a minute, back then it was 2019. I said 2019, information wants to be free. Nobody wants to pay for information, especially developers. But I think actually I'm happy that I didn't sort of take that lesson too seriously, because I jumped to the wrong conclusion now in hindsight. That it's not really true. In fact, I made a lot of money now selling information, different kinds of information, right? And sometimes even to developers, right? So that belief or that conclusion that developers don't pay for things. So in fact, I think a lesson that I learned with sort of these experiments is that sometimes we tend to jump to conclusions that are not warranted, right? That why did this fail? Why were people not willing to pay for it? Maybe I can take some educated guesses. But nowadays, I try to be careful not to read too much from these things, because I know that things are affected by random things, by good timing and other unpredictable things, that sometimes whether something succeeds or not is just things that we can't even see, right? It's just opaque things.
Yeah.
So that was another example. We mentioned the cutting boards. The cutting board started as purely as an experiment. I started woodworking just this time last year as a hobby, and at some point I was wondering, could I try to sell some of the things that I'm making? And eventually I bumped into the idea of wooden cutting boards. I launched the sort of the offering, I think in October of last year, so maybe 4 months ago. I sold about $5,000. Not a big thing. Sort of probably if I consider all the tools and everything, I might have just broken even. So it's still a failure in terms of expectation. Nevertheless, I still think that I gained something from the knowledge because I did ship, about a dozen around the world and learned a lot. But I think what's more important is that nowadays I feel less daunted by a physical product offering. So, you mentioned, for example, I have the profit and loss membership. That's another thing that was purely an experiment. Sort of, I was so a bit of a background story. I also have sort of this quarter time freelancing arrangement with Gumroad. Are you familiar with Gumroad? Sort of is this
Yes.
platform like
Yeah.
for digital products. And back then, when I joined the team, we were launching a feature memberships, like the ability to do recurring sort of payments. And I wanted an excuse to try to use the feature. Essentially, it was literally how it started. And I was wondering, what could I sell for a recurring fee? And I had already been very open with my finances for a long time on Twitter and in other places with my business finances, at least, like with how things are doing. And I thought, what if I tried to sell an even more detailed financial view, like with broken down by product, broken down with all the expenses and where the costs, basically the full profit and loss per product. And I started it, and when I started it, I was hoping that I could build like a community around these ideas of making money online and figuring out small bets and building a portfolio. I created a circle group. I was posting updates. So not only I was posting my financial results, but some commentary as well. Long story short, even though this financially, did okay, I did about $40,000 in total in about a year or so. I'm quite happy compared to the input I've put, but sort of my goal of building a community didn't really happen. Right? It sort of originally there was some momentum. I was getting lots of questions, but it never really changed from my talking about my own topic, and eventually things sort of stopped. The energy disappeared, and barely any activity continued to happen. Nevertheless, almost by surprise, recently my most recent project actually is a cohort-based course where we're meeting 25 members at a time. I launched this about 3 months ago or so, where we're having sort of this asynchronous basically course that we meet together, a small group, and we talk about these ideas in much more detail that we're discussing here, sort of finding inspiration, finding opportunities, juggling multiple things at the same time. And funny enough, even though it wasn't my intention, I set up a Discord server just for housekeeping purposes to share the Zoom links and the slides and whatever. And the community that I was hoping to build back then sort of happened there now, purely by accident. Like, this wasn't something I was almost trying to do, which is fascinating. And it sort of became, the community almost became the main selling point of this course, almost. Like, people are, word of mouth is spreading, there's about 100 people now, and people are encouraging others, come here, we're talking and getting good feedback and brainstorming ideas and things like that, which is, again, it's quite fascinating to me. Most of the things that have been successful, and even the failed things, but in particular the successful things, are things that I wouldn't have even imagined I'd be doing just a year ago or so. That was sort of very, very interesting. I had the idea before. I used to believe, business success is going to be a self-directed, top-down. You come up with the idea and you execute it. And now it's almost, I throw myself at random things, see what works, throw away the rest, right? And it's very, very unpredictable.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and it's also interesting to see that, well, you have this idea of having a community, and then you have an intention and the deliberate effort to do it, and it doesn't work out, and then it somehow by chance somehow creates
yeah.
itself, right? I think this is really an interesting perspective. I want to dig a little bit into your motivation. Then, do you think that you will be bored by what you're doing right now? And what is really your motivation behind that? For me, for example, I'm definitely an entrepreneur because I want to have the freedom to be with my kids And
Yeah.
I didn't see how I can do that in a job that fulfills
Hmm.
me being employed. It just wasn't
Yeah.
possible. There was nobody that would offer me the flexibility that I need, right? Working in the middle of the night or on the weekends, or having
Yeah.
like crazy 2 weeks of work and then 3 weeks doing nothing because the kids are sick, or and I feel like this is more important now for me. And that's definitely my motivation for being, I think, self-employed. What's your motivation? Why do you do that?
I think the motivation to become self-employed, I think, is similar to yours. And similar situation, I would say. So also two small kids. I was feeling like I'm leaving the house before they wake up. I arrive home very tired. They're about to go to sleep, and in the weekends, I also thinking about work. So maybe a bit different for me as a dad, but still sort of the same concern that
Hmm.
I felt like my kids are growing up and I can't spend time with them. So I was looking at people around me at Amazon, and I was noticing, things are probably going to get worse, not better. I wasn't envying the lifestyle, envying in a good sense of other people, no matter how much more they're getting paid or how much higher up they were. So I thought I'd be fooling myself if I were to believe it's going to be different for me. That if I just get the next promotion or the next bonus, suddenly things are going to be better.
Hmm.
So I jumped into self employment. And then once I did get all this flexibility, I think immediately I realized that I didn't really want this to be taken away from me. So suddenly I joke sometimes, I joke tweet about this as well, that my only business plan is not to go back to a full-time job. That I'm not thinking about goal driven, that I want to be a successful SaaS or this particular product or some idea or whatever. It's literally to make this lifestyle sustainable. So that, I would say, is it's a different, I think it's a different attitude, and I think it helps me with my decision making process as well, because when I do bump into these opportunities or I get inspired to do something, I ask myself, is this going to increase the odds, or is this likely to increase the odds of making this lifestyle sustainable or not?
That's true. Yeah. We started sort of at the same time with the entrepreneurship.
Hmm.
And I'm a big believer in that you have to enjoy the process, which I think is a little bit a different way of saying
Hmm.
the same thing that you just
Hmm.
said, right? So I only take on things where I feel it's not the end product that I will enjoy, but I enjoy the way going there. The
Hmm.
only problem, and I try to combat that, but I think it's very deeply internally in my genes or something, DNA, is that I have a hard time having the money focus all the time, right? So let's, for example, say I did a PhD, right? And from a
Hmm.
money perspective, this is such a stupid thing, right?
Hmm.
It's the worst thing, the worst decision that you can make, because you're not making money for a long time. You're putting a lot of effort, a lot of work into something. But I think I wasn't interested in the money. It was okay for me doing it just for the process, and I survived in a small apartment. Like we were thinking of, should we buy this vegetable or not? It was definitely this
Yeah.
kind of grinding. But in hindsight, I think I really try to do things differently now, because the sustainability part, is also a very, very important part for motivation, right? You
Hmm.
can be extremely motivated, and it can be such a fun to do something. But in the end of the day, and maybe this has to do with growing up and having a family, and, it's not only you
Hmm.
and, your crappy
Yeah.
apartment, but you have to provide for your family. And this comes with this aspect of also sustainability. I try to have that mindset much more of thinking
Hmm.
of, is that actually something I can keep up doing? And unfortunately, money is
Yeah.
a big part there, right? Is it coming very naturally to you that you think about
No,
those
no.
things?
I think actually I resonate. It's sort of I realized that I'm almost incapable of thinking properly about money unless I feel I need it. Right, and I think
Hmm.
probably I don't know if it's a different situation. Maybe that's sort of right now. My wife is staying at home with the kids. Sort of right now, I'm the primary income person, right? And sort
Hmm.
of I think that stressor of needing to make ends meet soon, because otherwise I would have had to go back to work. I think that was probably the most critical thing for me, to open my eyes and find opportunities, ignore and not ignore, I would say, right? And sort of being more prudent and not being too idealistic, and making better decisions essentially. And even now I notice that, because now with the types of work that I do, I have lots of ups and downs. My income is very volatile. If I launch something new, there's like big spikes and then sort of drops, sort of very spiky. So I'm noticing there's something very fascinating that I never noticed before, that when I'm riding the momentum of a high period, my mind almost shuts down. Like I can't work, I can't think, I'm not creative. And I think this is similar to what creators talk about when they mention, constraints breed creativity. Now, for example, early 2021, last year, the first, I would say, 7 months was a good period for me. I was riding the momentum of a couple of projects that I was doing, and I realized I don't need to think about money. I'm just going to experiment with hobbies. We took a 3-month vacation. Like we went back to Europe. I'm from Malta originally, and we spent the whole summer there. And just almost didn't do any work until September, basically, right? But then, sort of by September, things have dropped down to a point where it wasn't critical. So there's a buffer of savings and whatever. But I started to notice that if I'm not going to do something, things are going to start becoming negative again soon. So that was enough, right? And suddenly, I can almost see it, right? I can almost feel it, right? I started thinking of new promotion ideas, new products, new opportunities. And very quickly, I went into September. Then I went to a very high focus mode. Started the woodworking thing. I started the cohort-based course as well, pretty much a month after. I did a few new promotion campaigns for my existing products. And, again, like it changed its trajectory again. I sort of, again, not everything worked. Same thing, right? Some things worked better than others. But it's sort of very fascinating, it's as if these stressors are what I need to make me make the right decisions. I feel almost incapable to work if it doesn't. And we talked before we started recording, we talked a little bit about the project of building a house, a custom built house. But I think it's helping me as well because it's giving me some meaning to my income. I think if I didn't have that, I probably would be working much less. Those neurons would just sleep in my head, and just I would be less creative, less productive, and I would be seeing the world differently. And probably opportunities that I would consider now, I would ignore. I call it luck blindness. Like sometimes when you're in the state, you might bump into opportunities, but if you don't have that small stressor, you almost don't even see them, right? It's just because we're shut down. So I don't know if it's, I think I understand what you're saying. Maybe the circumstances are a bit different.
No, yeah, I can totally relate to what you're saying, especially with the house now, because the house shifted my whole thinking around money tremendously. I'm a very frugal person, extremely frugal. I have always been my whole life. And, it just didn't mean anything to me, money. But you can't be frugal with the house. I was actually thinking, like, now that we get our third baby, we have a very thank you, a very small car, and there's no way that you can fit 3 child seats into the last row, right? There are just 2.5 seats. So now we have to buy a new bigger car. And so I was brainstorming with my husband, and we were like, okay, so and it really helps me to think about products and my work. It gives so much meaning to me to thinking about, okay, this quarter of the car can come from that, and I could do this to get the other, and so having a very realistic way of how to spend the money definitely is extremely different or life-changing for me, for my mindset, because having that money just on the bank account or it has no meaning for me. But now it's part of a car, and can a kid sit there or not, right?
Absolutely.
And so
absolutely.
on. Another thing that I wanted to ask you, and maybe it's probably the final question that I have for you, and that I think is super interesting for all my listeners, is how do we deal with scope creep, but also how can we let go? Because, for example, one of the things is when I looked at you, and especially at the beginning, you were only on Twitter, right? So you tried a little bit to be on Medium, but very quickly realized, you have a couple of very dedicated and deliberate blog posts, but you never started really like you're a blogger now, or you're building like an audience on the blog. You were building your audience on Twitter. And this, I found it really inspirational because I was also like, I didn't have enough time to be on Twitter and on Instagram and on, whatnot, and then you're doing a shitty job on all of them, and you're just. But now when I looked at your website, I saw you say oh, you can find me on Twitter, Gumroad, Instagram, and Clubhouse. And I thought, like, is that
Hmm.
a little bit of a scope creep? Is that are you now on many things? Do you feel like you're,
Yeah.
or do you still have like a very deliberate way of choosing where you are and how to also say, okay, I tried Clubhouse and maybe now it's not working and I let it go?
Yeah, yeah. I wish I had a precise answer. I think it mostly goes by gut feel, to be honest. In fairness, sort of full disclosure, in the beginning, I tried many, many different things. As
Mm-hmm.
you noticed, I was on Medium, but not just that. I think, little bit of background story. I think what I realized the very first week when I
Mm-hmm.
started working for myself, I realized I had no reputation outside of the couple of companies that I had worked from. Nobody knew who I was, and I wasn't thinking building an audience back then. I was thinking, can I build some reputation? Can I make some people know about me? And I was thinking, how
Mm-hmm.
can I go out there and help people? I was doing some open source. On Reddit, I was very active for a few months. Stack Overflow, LinkedIn, Quora, Twitter, on Medium, on Hacker News, LinkedIn. Almost everything that I could give it a try. I dedicated probably a couple of months just experimenting different things. Some things I gave up quickly. Some things it took me a few more months. Long story short, mostly Twitter was the only one that stuck around. And if you were to ask me what were the exact signals that made me choose that, I can't really say exactly. It just felt there was something that was working better. The return on investment seems to be better. And again, almost like procrastination or something similar, a cousin of procrastination. Something was making me feel like, what's the point of spending more time on Stack Overflow if this is not conducive to more people knowing about me? It's sort of it's not that I wasn't helping people there, but it wasn't really translating to me building a reputation, which I know sounds a bit selfish. But in that period, that was my goal, right? I wanted to get
Yeah.
myself known a little bit. And over time, I still experiment, right? Sort of cocktail party,
Yeah, it was a big
without all
thing
the
last
downside.
year.
But again, for some reason, I lost motivation. Right, I stopped going. But, so I still keep my eyes open for various reasons because again, new opportunities, diversification as well. Sort of who knows? Right, sort of I'm nowadays with Twitter. I feel like I have something to lose. This is a common problem since I have 100,000 followers or so. I'm concerned, to some degree that what if that were to disappear? What if the algorithm changes? What if I get kicked out for some reason, or who knows, or get hacked or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
So again, in the back of my mind, ways of diversifying that. I haven't really found anything concrete yet.
Yeah.
So it's not scope creep. I would call it. I think it's just still part of my experimentation phase. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's perfectly fine. I think it's really important that we experiment, that we try out things. And what I also do is that if I feel it's not like, for example, Twitter, right?
Hmm.
Um, there could be that I'm not posting something for a couple of months just because I don't feel like
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And I really like this freedom, and maybe like there's no comparison between
Hmm.
your Twitter account and my Twitter account. It's a really small account,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I don't want to be like the slave of Twitter, right?
Hundred
Or
percent.
whatever I
Yes.
want to have, like, and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
sometimes, like in the summer or something, and there was a lot of a stressful time or even a beautiful time, right? Sometimes I just
Hmm.
didn't feel like I have something to contribute, and then I'm not I'm not doing it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I'm really not a fan of sort of these ideas that you need to be prolific and tweeting all the time, all the days. Sure, that might be the best strategy to build the
Hmm.
audience faster, but what's the point? As you're saying, I think what I wanted to my ideal situation is that this becomes something that I enjoy doing because if not, chances are it won't last, right? So, like
Exactly.
you,
Yeah.
in summer, I think between June and August, I almost didn't tweet at all because I was spending time with my family. I might have tweeted a couple of times. Yes, my follower growth stopped, and maybe I even lost some. But like, who cares, right? It's this idea that everything needs to be done in the most optimal way, sort of the fastest growth trajectory or whatever. It's just very, as you mentioned, you sort of you become a slave of the process, right?
Yeah.
In general, I dislike. These are all extrinsic things, right? That I think they feel very unnatural. Like sort of, you need to keep the streak. Uninterrupted streak of posting daily or blogging every week or whatever. It's things that I feel like those things that I feel liberated once I break them, that's a sign
Yeah.
that I should probably not be doing them in the first
Yeah,
place.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is why I'm, an entrepreneur, to have this flexibility and the freedom to choose. So, but I don't want to take too much of your time anymore. Daniel, thank you so much for being on my show. I really enjoyed talking to you. We could, continue for another hour, but let's be very deliberate with our time as well. And yeah, and that's it. Thank you so much, Daniel, for being on my show. It was really a
Thank you,
pleasure.
Michaela. This was very fun. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. This was another episode of the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please help me spread the word about the podcast. Send the episode to a friend via email, Twitter, LinkedIn, well, whatever messaging system you use, or give it a positive review on your favorite podcasting platform such as Spotify or iTunes. This would mean really a lot to me. So thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will talk to you in 2 weeks. Bye.